Well, from sports to a entirely different concern, we have a way of celebrating big literary anniversaries here on North by Northwest. We celebrate with Spencer Stuart, our resident books expert. And yesterday marked a very big literary anniversary for our neighbors to the south, and really for all poetry lovers worldwide. May 31st marked 200 years since the birth of Walt Whitman, affectionately known as the Old Gray Poet. Spencer told me that as a child, Whitman was enrolled in the fairly new Brooklyn public school system, and that lasted until his family's financial situation took a dive, and Whitman had to leave school at the age of 11 to go to work.
And this is really where we begin to see the formation of Walt Whitman as an autodidact. This is something that's kind of interesting about him as a poet, and why he's an interesting national poet, especially in the American context, is that he's a self-made person in terms of the way he educates himself. At this period of time, you still have poets who are going through, some of the famed institutions and private schools, and are very learned in the classics. And you see with Whitman, even at an early age, a sort of an insatiable thirst to read up on everything he's interested in: science, theology, all these things.
Sort of an intellectual version of rugged independence.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
No, absolutely. And in 1831, one of the first jobs he takes up is he sort of helps out some lawyers in the Long Island area, and they provide him with a subscription to the circulation libraries, and that's where he starts to kind of read as much as he can. And in 1832, he becomes a compositor, or he's an apprentice compositor for a newspaper on Long Island called The Patriot, which is it's a kind of working class paper. And not only is he setting type for the newspaper, he actually writes his first article in that year too. So at the age of about 12, he's published.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah. So
as a journalist?
As a journalist, I was trying to dig up what was the first article. I believe it was something to do with land rights, but it was something of a kind of left of center political idea, which would have been very much in tune with what his father, who also shares the same name, was interested in as a man who saw America form through the American Revolution. And
so Whitman was sort of a legend in his own time in America, if I understand it correctly. How did he sort of get that reputation?
He's in the 1840s. He goes into New York proper, into kind of Manhattan area, and he's working for many of the newspapers, and I think that's really where his identity, retrospectively, in a lot of ways, became, he's the poet of the country, because he's in the metropolis. He's in one of the sort of most rapidly developing cities in all of the Union. And at that time, it's interesting. Some of the authors that we know to be also emblematic of that period in American literature, Poe, Melville, characters like this, they saw Manhattan as kind of a dirty place. I mean, sort of imagine like cobblestones, horse manure everywhere, and it's a loud and rough city. Whitman rather went the absolute opposite direction. He totally embraced it. You see in his journals at that period of time, he's writing down people's vernacular, what they're saying, names of people he's talking to. He's absorbing it like a total sponge. And what really also changes it is in 1848, he goes down to New Orleans for about 3 months to try and take up a job as a journalist down there. And at that point, he's exposed to the cultural diversity of New Orleans, the mixing of races, which is something that he thought was really a powerful asset to the country. But he also saw the horrors of the slave trade. And I think that's really where you see him as one of the most powerful voices coming out of the 19th century, is that he wasn't afraid to turn, he never turned his face away from some of the horrible realities of the States.
So his reputation these days rests on, well, a large body of work, but if he's known for any one particular thing, it's probably his collection Leaves of Grass, which,
that's right, yeah.
which in his lifetime was published in a number of different versions. Can you tell me a little bit about how it started and sort of how Leaves of Grass changed as Whitman's life went on?
Yeah, he refers to it from the outset as an experiment. He was a huge advocate for democracy, and he believed that the society changed individuals and individuals changed the society, and it was an ongoing dialogue. And Leaves of Grass really sits at the center of all of that as a project. He's writing little pieces throughout the 1840s and into the 50s. But he then sets out to actually, publish a work, and he enlists the help of his friend in Brooklyn Heights by the name of Andrew Rome, who wasn't even a book publisher or printer. He was actually a printer of legal documents.
Okay.
Which explains why, when you see a first edition of Leaves of Grass, it's 11 inches high and 8 inches across. So this is at the time of sort of smaller books of poetry. You're walking in the Lake District reading Wordsworth, and here comes this absolutely audacious book, which he designs the front cover of. It's gilt. Interestingly enough, his name isn't even on it, and there are actually no titles to the poems. It starts as 12 poems, and ultimately it balloons through the various editions to close to 400 poems,
Wow.
as well as 2 annexes by the end of his life, the so-called deathbed edition that he does just before he passes away.
How did that first edition of Leaves of Grass strike the public when that was first published?
The response was almost entirely negative, in some cases hostile. He was, first of all, writing in a very kind of open form. It was a very different type of poetic style that people couldn't really identify. On top of that, he was talking about various forms of love, love between two men, and the body in particular. He really did believe that the physical body was sort of a manifestation of a kind of cosmic reality. He's interested in these sort of pantheistic ideas at that time. Ralph Waldo Emerson had a copy, and he read it, and he said that he didn't really know what to make of it. He kind of referred to it as a bit of a beast. It had not yet really formed into something, but nevertheless, he actually did see a lot of promise in it, and actually, indeed, in that same year, wrote a letter to Whitman in which he greets him at the beginning of a very successful career. Which Whitman then goes on in 1856 to put on the spine of the copy that he publishes.
Audacious.
Absolutely, yeah. It was pretty. It was actually, it's believed to be one of the first blurbs to be used to sell literature. So, pretty wild.
So when you look at those first editions, aside from the very strange size and shape and gilt cover, what else is worth noting about that volume?
Well, to go back to Andrew Rome and his brother Tom, who helped print it, and actually also there's evidence to suggest Walt was also doing the printing as well.
Wow.
Yeah, he was. Well, he's a compositor; he can't help but be
Sure.
around it, you know. And he, one of the things is that they were using a hand press, so they weren't actually. They had to set the type for the page each time. And it's an extremely cumbersome process in which, if there's not enough tension or tightness on the text block, it can slide off and things like this. So actually, you could actually say of the first edition, which there were 795 copies made, you could say that each one was unique. There's enough textual variance to just fill up a whole day with lists. You look at various editions now, of which we can locate 158. There's believed to be about 200 still circulating around in the world. There are slips everywhere, including there was one that's at the end of his most famous poem, in which he doesn't have a period at the end of it, and scholars went for quite some time. I celebrate myself to see that there's no period. What does it all mean? So it was a very ad hoc situation, and it is also documented that by about the 300th copy that they were doing in this kind of lavish style, that Walt Whitman, who was running out of money at this point, had to kind of scale back the process, so that by the end of it, there's about 100 of them from that 795 that are just in paper wrappers. They don't even have the cloth bound cover, and
really
they're
cutting
not
corners
gilt.
there.
Yeah, it's just totally falling apart. Yeah.
This guy, it strikes me that he must be something of a nightmare for literature professors, just on account of not only did he keep changing his works over time from edition to edition to edition and adding stuff and changing things. But within a single edition, there can be such variance in the poems, even to something as fundamental as punctuation.
Yeah, well, luckily online there's the Walt Whitman archive, which has kind of been provided by a couple of scholars who have dedicated their entire lives to Whitman, in which they're tracking the variance and sort of they're getting a sense that there was really it was a chaotic situation. Whitman later on in his life also sort of jokingly mentioned that the manuscript itself that they used to create the text block was indeed probably used to fuel a fire by Andrew Rome later in the year. So we don't really have much by way of evidence as to what was the quote unquote original text that Whitman was using. I know that there was additions that he was changing things around as he was doing it too, much to the chagrin of Andrew Rome, sort of driving him crazy as he's moving things around. So. Yeah, too many cooks in the kitchen, I'd say.
So how did Whitman's reputation progress from that original kind of confounded reaction on behalf of Emerson and many others who found that first edition towards the end of his life?
It's sort of thought of in two ways. There's the European reception of Whitman, which very much kind of keeps the legacy alive. And there's an American one that's within his lifetime, certainly reluctant. In 1870, the president of Yale referred to Leaves of Grass, which had subsequently gone to other editions, and Whitman had gotten more audacious in his content and the way he was describing the world. He described it as the equivalent of walking naked through the streets. They didn't purchase it, and indeed many libraries did not purchase it. There's really only one instance, which is the City Company of Philadelphia's library. Purchased a copy during his lifetime. And there are people who are really celebrating him as well. Like 1882, Oscar Wilde comes to visit him. And so there were people certainly who were keeping an eye on him. And Whitman also went in and out of writing poetry. At one point in time, he was extremely preoccupied with the Civil War. His brother was injured in 1861 around Christmas time, and he went to go help him out in Fredericksburg, and ultimately stayed on, moving on to Washington, D.C., in which he took up a job as a clerk in the Department of the Interior, and would walk around and actually, with a big bag, provide gifts to the various soldiers on the northern and southern side of the conflict, and helping them with stationery to write letters, and in some cases helping them write the letters. He really did feel there was a kind of a rupture going on in the country at that time. And from that, of course, made a huge body of work afterwards through drum taps, which was added to the experiment of Leaves of Grass.
So I'm preoccupied by thinking of what a conversation between Oscar Wilde and Walt Whitman might have sounded like.
Oscar Wilde said he was his favorite person in all of the United States when he went on his visit.
Wow.
It was kind of a famous press tour. He wandered around, and this was one that he really made a point to go see. Which is interesting. There's a story also in the 1866, or rather 1856, in which Thoreau is encouraged to go meet him by way of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And at that point in time, Whitman's about 37 years old and puts on airs as like the kind of unkept poet genius, kind of madman, huge beard, yeah. Which it's so funny. I'm trying to trace like when his beard turned white, because in the 1860s when he's helping people in the Civil War, he was referred to as Santa Claus.
Really?
Because he would wander. He had this big beard even then that was white. And his image as the kind of bearded poet, as the old gray poet as he was referred to. It's even almost fostered in the first edition, where his name isn't anywhere in the poems, but when you turn the page to just on to the inside where the title page is, there's this shot of him kind of resting his hand on his waist. It's he's really got this kind of image of himself even at an early age.
Maybe it's a bit of an affectation. I think about that sometimes with Johannes Brahms, the composer, as well, who grew the big professor beard at a fairly young age and always sort of put on airs of being an old world-weary man.
Yeah, It's a good look. I mean,
Sure. I too have been accused of this.
Yes, yeah. If only I had more time to grow the beard, maybe it will happen in time for sure. I mean, certainly Allen Ginsberg, who was, definitely influenced by Whitman in a lot of ways, he rocked the beard as well. He got it going.
Sure.
Yeah.
Did you ever look at any of these, any of the reporting in the New York Times about when Whitman was on his deathbed?
No.
They published a thing just a couple months ago, I feel, that sort of lined up all of the short pieces that the Times published, and it was front page news for months when he took ill for the last time. And sometimes it's a real blast from the past. It's a very different kind of journalism. And there are times when all that they'll say is, beloved poet Walt Whitman is feeling much better today, is able to sit upright and has eaten a whole potato or something like that. So obviously by the time he passed away, he had become a beloved enough figure, at least among the readers of the New York Times.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, no, he had, Maurice Buck, who I'd mentioned earlier, who became his literary executor, wrote a biography on him, and you see, he's beloved by that point, but throughout the majority of his life, he's sort of persona non grata in terms of people are aware of him, they're aware of his writing, and he's obviously celebrated in circles, but I don't think really fulfilled like the image that he'd had early on of his poetry, where he thought that the coach driver would be reading his poetry and the common laborer.
Well, we seem to have come around to him now. So, well, thanks for this, Spencer. This has been a joy.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
That's Spencer Stuart, our resident books expert. Yesterday was the 200th anniversary of Walt Whitman's birth. By the way, I looked again at those New York Times pieces on Whitman's final illness, and it wasn't a potato that Whitman ate on the day I was thinking of. It was, in fact, a small mutton chop. I regret the error.